So we have been planning this event for about a year, and I could not be more excited to introduce this panel. This is a new, I'm an economist, but this is a new area of research for me. It's not one that I had worked in previously, but a number of these folks are my newfound heroes in competition economics and policy. So with that little giddy introduction, allow me to introduce them. First, we have Barry Lynn, who directs the Open Markets Program and is a senior fellow at the New America Foundation. He is the author of Cornered, The New Monopoly Capitalism and the Economics of Destruction, which is, I think, a fantastic title, and Into the Line, The Rise and Coming Fall of the Global Corporation. Lynn's writing focuses on interdependence among nations, and the growing fragility of complex industrial systems has been presented to officials in China, Japan, Germany, Britain, France, Taiwan, and the European Commission, as well as in the White House and the U.S. Treasury Department. His writings on the political and economic effects of the consolidation of power in the United States have been influential to policymakers and antitrust professionals on both sides of the Atlantic. Next to him, we have John Kwoka, who is the Neal F. Finnegan Distinguished Professor of Economics at Northeastern University. Professor Kwoka is the author and editor of 3 books and more than 75 articles in the areas of industrial economics, antitrust, and regulation. His co-edited book of antitrust cases, The Antitrust Revolution, is a staple in the field of industrial organization. And his newest book, Mergers, Merger Control, and Remedies, a retrospective analysis of U.S. policy, was published this past December by MIT Press. He's a research fellow of the American Antitrust Institute and on the boards of the Industrial Organization Society and the Review of Industrial Organization. He has also served at the Federal Trade Commission, the Antitrust Division of the Justice Department, and the Federal Communications Commission. So it's very exciting to have some folks who've served both in academia and also in policymaking roles. And I just want to sort of elevate how we're really trying to connect the dots between the two in this panel this morning. Next, we have Fiona Scott Morton, who is the Theodore Nierenberg Professor of Economics at the Yale University School of Management, where she's been on the faculty since 1999. Her area of research is imperial industrial organization with a focus on competition. From 2011 to 2012, Professor Scott Morton served as the Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Economics at the Antitrust Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. She has served in an editing role in various academic economics journals, has won several research grants from the National Science Foundation, and is a research associate at the NBER. So moderating this panel is Diane Bartz, a longtime antitrust reporter at Reuters, huge fan of your work, and so excited to have you moderating this panel this morning. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Diane and let you all have at it. So thank you.
Good morning. Let's talk about antitrust. It's on now. Good. Good morning. Let's talk about antitrust. I cannot think of an industry that isn't better today because of past actions by antitrust enforcers. You know, going back into dusty history, Standard Oil was broken up in 1911 after it formed a trust to control something like 90% of U.S. oil production. AT&T, reliable but stayed, was broken up in 1982. One of our panelists, Fiona Scott Morton, will discuss how these actions and how antitrust enforcement in general is important in slowing increases in income inequality. Right now, antitrust enforcement agencies are really busy. The Justice Department is prosecuting price fixers. Most notably, they have a big probe of auto parts. Dozens of people have been charged criminally, and many of them have gone to jail. A second panelist, Barry Lynn, will discuss how tech companies agreed not to hire away each other's employees, essentially creating a kind of labor cartel. Turning to the current merger tsunami, in less than 2 years, the Justice Department and the FTC have stopped mergers in office supplies, tuna, hospitals, chemicals, oil services, newspaper publishing, kitchen appliances, food distribution, and cable television, among others. In fact, yesterday there was news that companies that make the machines that make chips, that a merger of 2 of those companies was stopped. The last of our panelists, John Kwoka, will talk about controversial mergers which were allowed to go forward. So there's still some improvement to be made. Mr. Lynn, you want to take it away?
Thank you, Diane, and thank you also, Heather. Really thrilled that the Washington Center for Equitable Growth is getting into this line of inquiry, because it's a pretty big deal. I guess I'll touch on the point that Diane mentioned before about sort of the effects on, of cartels, labor cartels on workers. But my initial task is to kind of sketch out how we got to where we are today politically, and do that in about 5 minutes. My main point is that antitrust, anti-monopoly is political. It has always been, it's not an economic form of regulation. It involves the regulation of the economy, but at the most fundamental level, it's political, and it's always been the case. And to get a sense about that, if we go back to the revolution, actually even before the revolution, 1773, the Boston Tea Party was a rebellion against the monopoly. People say that it was fundamentally a rebellion against taxation, but if you go back and look at the writings of the people like Sam Adams, people like John Hancock, what they were rebelling against was this idea that a giant trading company was going to come into the United States and take over our markets and basically intermediate the actions between the citizen as a producer and the citizen as a buyer. So they rebelled, and they said they were rebelling in order to protect their liberties to interact directly with one another without an intermediary in between them, setting the terms. Over the course of the 19th century, what Americans realized is that anti-monopoly was key to all these other political goals that we had. We learned that anti-monopoly was key to preserving our democratic institutions. That's because if you allow for a few people to control, to build up huge amounts of wealth, they can subvert those institutions. They also learned that anti-monopoly was key to the preservation of power within communities, the sovereignty of communities. The idea that the people who lived in Philadelphia, the people that live in Peoria, should have control over their own commerce and not actually have some distant company that's located very, very far away, like the British East India Company, control commerce in that community. The family, people came to understand that anti-monopoly was fundamental to the preservation of, to giving people the power to, maintain their families as they saw fit. Anti-monopoly, they understood, and this goes back to all the discussions about patents. It was fundamental to innovation. By 1863, you see anti-monopoly in the form of at the time of some of the first federal laws on banking policy, is being used to ensure the stability of complex systems, banking systems. So what we have is anti-monopoly was, in the 19th century, we used it to preserve our liberties, preserve our democracy, preserve our communities, preserve our families, ensure innovation, and ensure the stability of complex systems. Now, there was a change, and we know that something went wrong because we know there was the Gilded Age. We know the plutocrats marched around this earth. And the thing is, there's a missing revolution in American history. There's a revolution that took place that we don't talk about as a revolution. The Second American Revolution was a revolution against the plutocrats. Where did they go? They vanished. They ceased to exist. They were shunted off to their mansions out on Long Island. But they didn't have power anymore. They didn't have the ability to accumulate such massive piles of wealth as they once did. The Second American Revolution, which began really with the election in 1912 of President Wilson, and it was fundamentally an anti-monopoly revolution. It played out over the course of 20 years between 1913 and really the Second New Deal, 1936, 1937, And if you look at what actually took place, it was the application of anti-monopoly principles in every single sector of the American political economy. And so the world in which we grew up in the 20th century was fundamentally shaped. It was shaped in every single way by the philosophy of anti-monopoly. The liberties that we enjoyed, the democracy that we preserved, it was due to the reapplication of anti-monopoly at the federal level against the plutocrats and their giant combinations and corporations. So what happened? What happened was that back in the 1970s and 1980s, a group of folks came along and they said, all of these protections that you guys have erected, these political protections, they're getting in the way of the construction of more material goods for you. So what we need to do is we need to take this whole philosophy of anti-monopoly that you have established at the fundaments of your political economy. We need to change this. And they said, well, we need to change it. We need to change it so that it promotes the welfare of the consumer, the material well-being of the consumer. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to have anti-monopoly now promote not competitive markets. We're going to use anti-monopoly to promote efficiency. So basically, these guys, these are the Chicago schoolers, they came up with a philosophy for anti-monopoly, and they used this philosophy to change how we apply these laws and policies across the whole spectrum. They changed the philosophy of our political economy. And this promotion of efficiency was really fundamentally a promotion of monopoly. Now, there were some people who didn't understand what they were doing. They thought this was a good idea. There were people who actually understood what they were doing, and their intention was to concentrate power in the hands of certain people. Now, one of the reasons we haven't had a really good conversation about this for 35 years is because they had help. The Chicago schoolers had help, and it came from the statists on the left. When the Chicago schoolers went to Congress and they said, this is what we're going to do, they got an amen, a really strong amen, and it was from the people on the Galbraithian side of political economics, people who were unabashedly pro-statist. They wanted to concentrate power in the state. So you had a statist on one side, people who wanted to concentrate power in the private estate, working with people on the statist side of the left, and they basically combined to overthrow this philosophy that we use for 200 years to preserve our liberties and our democracy and our communities and our family. So anyway, that's an initial statement about how we got here.
Thanks a million. John, take it away.
Thank you, Diane, and thank you, Heather and Alyssa, as well. It's a pleasure to be here and to have a chance to talk about this issue, which is of increasing and widespread importance. 6 months ago, the White House issued an executive order on competition in the U.S. economy, and it instructed cabinet departments and executive branch agencies to integrate competition concerns more fully into what they do. It clearly deferred to the two antitrust agencies, the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice, for primary responsibility on the matters that directly implicate competition. But for many other agencies, competition had simply not been on the radar. And the executive order imposed or set out certain requirements for agencies to pay further attention and to chronicle their attention that they did pay to competition issues. The executive order was preceded by a few days by an issue brief from the Council of Economic Advisors. And the issue brief, I think, set the foundation for the EO. In particular, it pointed to several facts, disturbing trends in concentration, in profits, and in formation of new businesses that raised concern about the level of competition in the U.S. economy. And while it drew no hard conclusion, the facts as they lined up suggested that there might be some hardening of the arteries of competition in the U.S. economy, a truly disturbing trend. What I would like to do is to talk a little bit about where the antitrust agencies fit into the mission. In particular, what I'd like to do is to provide a little bit of context about what I believe the role of economics has been at the antitrust agencies, and whether the agencies, and offer some facts about how well the agencies have been pursuing their mission. I would point out, to append the following to Barry's comments, is that there always has been within the economics profession a group of scholars and practitioners who did not subscribe to Chicago School, nor were they seduced by the Chicago School views of the economy. The Chicago School had some therapeutic value in bringing rigor to the way we thought about competition and other market issues. And some of the past 20 years has been spent in the agencies and in academia and in policy circles in bringing a wider, broader, more nuanced perspective to how economics should be incorporated in the work of the agencies. What has happened is that the analytic apparatus of economics has, in many ways, come to be front and center for the analytical process at the Justice Department and FTC. The merger guidelines, in particular, are a statement that puts into hard copy various technical concepts and analytical methods that are being used and to analyze mergers. And the guidelines not only document that, but they also are intended to provide guidance to the business community as to how mergers will be evaluated. The idea, of course, is to provide some certainty so that the business community will know how particular combinations or practices will be evaluated. It is fair to say, and a recent speech by the Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust, Renata Hess, has pointed out that this may have inadvertently narrowed the focus of analytical policy at the agencies to some very particular outcomes as metrics for competition. And she points out that the original legislation had articulated a standard about lessening of competition as opposed to specific things like efficiencies and price increases and measures of competition through various metrics. And her point, I believe, was that to some degree we need to bear in mind that the broader purpose has always been in the law, and that economics hasn't necessarily always focused on that, but rather is focused on the technical facets of this, technical outcomes of this that are more measurable and observable. So I'd like to just offer a couple comments about how the agencies have implemented their mission in the past 15 or 20 years. In particular, over the past 4 or 5 years, I've been conducting a substantial research project that has looked at a series of questions about mergers and about merger policy in this country, with the view to asking fundamental questions. What has been the outcome of mergers? What has been the effect of merger policy? We all have anecdotes. We all fly airlines and have our views about that. We all know about hospital mergers. We have views about drug companies and office supply stores and the long list of things that Diane mentioned. But what I have done is to compile what I call careful economic studies of the outcomes of mergers. Careful economic studies are those that control for other things which have happened before and after the merger, so we don't inadvertently ascribe to the merger something that is the result of cost pressures that have affected everybody and things of that sort. There have been thousands of mergers over this period of time. I don't have thousands of such studies. I've got dozens of such studies. But the value is that it's not just one or two that may be cherry-picked and prove a particular point. And so what I have is what I would call semi-systematic evidence. It's the best, most comprehensive set of data I think we have. And what it has shown is the following 2 or 3 things. One is that combining all of these studies and aggregating them, mergers in the U.S. have resulted, these carefully studied mergers in the U.S., the overwhelming majority have resulted in price increases, net of everything else, controlling for everything else. Maybe 75% or more have resulted in price increases. And the average price increase is about 9%. So the point here is that mergers have been allowed through, which have systematically resulted in, on average, in price increases. And that suggests that the enforcement over this long period of time, 20 years or so, has not drawn the line in quite the right place. That the mergers that they've challenged have been deserving of challenge, but there have been some that have been allowed through. Now, we all have our favorite examples in the past few years, of course, of mergers that were allowed through with questionable justification or with remedies that may not have been effective. The second result of mine is that I've looked at the effective remedies. Most mergers that are carefully studied by the agencies are not challenged, but rather they go through a process of divestiture or some other remedy that's intended to address the narrow competitive concern, but allow the rest of the merger to proceed. Remedies in these studies have been shown to be distinctly ineffective, and certain types of remedies, so-called conduct remedies, have really been the worst of the bunch. And so I have been an advocate of limiting the use of remedies and to challenge mergers more often, because it seems to me that the evidence supports exactly that. The final thing I want to mention is that an entirely different data set comes from one of the agencies itself. This is not something from academic studies, and it tracks the way that the agency has changed its enforcement practice. Maybe not a conscious decision, but de facto how the agency has changed its enforcement practice. So in brief, we didn't come here to learn about data analysis, but in brief, the agency lists the number of mergers of different sorts and the number and the percent that they have taken enforcement action against. So you either clear a merger or take some sort of enforcement action. And they do this by measures of concentration called the Herfindahl index, but an easier metric to understand is the number of remaining competitors after a merger, number of significant remaining competitors. So a so-called 2-to-1 merger would be a merger to monopoly, two firms would merge to one, 7 to 6 would be as it describes. So if I may see the first slide, this is basically a screenshot from a data release, and what it shows is that for mergers that essentially are 2-to-1, a very high fraction, nearly 100%, trigger some enforcement action as we would expect. But as you go down the list so that there are more remaining competitors, not surprisingly, the percent enforcement declines. This is consistent with common intuition of every economic theory, et cetera, et cetera. But what I have done is to take the data and to do some arithmetic and to look at the way that enforcement pattern has changed over time. If I can see the next slide, please. What this shows is that for mergers, that are 2-to-1 or 3-to-2, very high concentration and few remaining competitors, the percent of enforcement actions taken, which is the vertical axis on the left side, the percent of enforcement actions taken has, in fact, increased a little bit. So the agency is aggressive in dealing with mergers that arise in industries where the remaining number of competitors would be 2 or 3 or 4. But as you see, starting in 2003-04, and certainly accelerating through the 2000s up through the latest data, 2011, mergers that result in 5, 6, 7, or 8 remaining competitors have elicited no challenges whatsoever. So these are the worrisome mergers. This is where competition policy, merger policy has focused its attention on the high concentration issues, well justified, but has increasingly cleared, approved, not challenged mergers at moderate to high concentration. And we've witnessed as a result a lot of industries with rising concentration up to some point of danger, but where there has not been the challenges that certainly historically have arisen in those zones of concentration. So there's more to be said, but let me leave it at that for now.
That's great. Fiona.
Thank you. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, everybody, for the invitation. Let me just remind the audience how antitrust and inequality are connected. In the U.S. economy, the holdings of corporate shares are much more concentrated among the wealthy than is consumption. So if you thought about paying $5 more a month for your cell phone bill, that would affect most people in the economy, but those profits would flow to very few people in the economy because it's, the wealth distribution is even more concentrated than the income distribution. So to the extent that we have more competition and we drive down economic profits and we have competitive outcomes, that increases equality rather than inequality. So that's why we're all here. I think there has been a suggestion that rising income inequality might be because of lax antitrust enforcement. I will just say my view of antitrust enforcement under the Obama administration is that it has been excellent. Of course, I participated in that, so it's slightly self-serving, but I do actually think that that's not the place to look. I have 3 other suggestions. One suggestion is that we need to start enforcing against mutual funds and index funds and deal with the common ownership problem. So we have index funds that now own all 4 airlines or all major banks, all firms in an oligopoly. Their interest is higher stock prices. Those stock prices will grow if the firms soften competition and don't compete as hard. So the firms are happy to do that, the executives are happy to do that, the mutual fund is happy with that, and the consumer ends up paying higher prices. So I think that's a place, that's a kind of a novel area. Index funds were invented only recently, and we're going to have to take policy action there. The second place, which I think is extremely important, is competition goals in other agencies. Other agencies are, set up to have different goals. For example, ensure a healthy domestic airline industry. That really doesn't have anything to do with consumers. If you interpret it narrowly, it looks like what you're supposed to be doing is maximizing airline profits. So we shouldn't be surprised if that's what the Department of Transportation is doing. The executive order can ask the Department of Transportation to stop doing that and to pay more attention to competition. But realistically, if the Department of Transportation cared about competition, it probably would be worrying about that already. And having an executive order saying, please worry about it, is a nice ask, but it's probably not going to accomplish anything all on its own. So we need to follow up this executive order with some structural changes or other kinds of programs and plans if we'd like those agencies to change. I think I gave you the Department of Transportation as one example. Another one I think is ripe for action is the FDA, which really has a safety mandate, but it matters a lot to prices and to competition in the pharmaceutical industry, which products are available to consumers. So, for example, if you have a 2 or 3 year delay getting a generic drug onto the market, then that's a period of time in which there's less competition that benefits consumers. Now, inaction is hard to fix, so I think that regulations that suppress competition inside these agencies are going to stay there until somebody takes action. And the question is, do we devolve that responsibility to the agency itself, which really may be primarily focused on protecting the firms that it's regulating? Or maybe we could bring OIRA into the picture. Maybe we could bring the competition agencies into the picture in some kind of formal way with some kind of formal role. I would say that requires more funding for the antitrust agencies if you're going to give them another job in this area. But I think this is a good place for creative work. My third suggestion is to think about using the consumer protection mandate of the FTC to stimulate competition by helping develop metrics that would allow consumers to compare firms more effectively. There are a number of products that we see today, like media bundles, health insurance, my music subscription service. These are hard for consumers to shop among because they're just complicated. So if I'm trying to choose a Medicare Part D plan for next year, I have to know what drugs I'm likely to consume. I have to know the prices of those drugs. I have to know where I live. I have to know the difference between a deductible and a premium. And a lot of consumers find that challenging, and the result is they're sort of throwing darts. And when you throw darts, you don't get firms to compete, because what would my reward be if I were a firm that lowered price in this market? No consumer would come to me because they're throwing darts. So you're not going to get aggressive competition in that kind of setting. Suppose you had a consumer protection arm that said, all right, we're going to develop a tool that lets consumers quickly develop a dollar number for their prescription drug expenditures for next year. For example, we have annual percentage rate in the credit card market. An APR is a government-defined number, and that's a summary statistic that lets consumers compare one credit card to another. One says 12, the other says 14. It's clear to me that the 12% credit card is cheaper. So if we had more action in this regard, then that would give consumers a tool that they could use to move between firms. It would be a reliable price signal consumers could use to move between firms, and I think that would let the firms themselves then compete because there would be some merit to it. I would lower my price, this statistic would move, and consumers would come and buy my product. And that's how well-functioning markets like the market for bread works. We're not confused. We go into the supermarket and we see that one loaf of bread costs less than another, and we're well able to shop there, and we get competition in that circumstance. So I think the information provision is not enough. It has to be something like all retail banks will give the FTC every year their tariff for ATM visits, checks, cashier's checks, bounce checks, all the things that introduce a fee. And that output in a standardized way is something that the government can use to create a tool that consumers can then use to price shop. So those would be three kind of suggestions that I have that I feel would improve competition in America that are related to antitrust but are not really about the fundamentals of existing enforcement.
Okay, great. I have a couple of questions. John, first of all, Wall Street, I'm reading in Wall Street Analysts about really aggressive antitrust enforcement right now. And I note your slides with interest. I'm just wondering, like, how many deals are there in a given year? How many are approved really quickly, 30, 60 days? How many get a long, or what percentage get a long review? And what percentage are actually stopped?
So that's a good question. Since it's certainly, if one were to simply read the Wall Street Journal, you might think that every merger under the sun was being aggressively investigated. There's probably, someone tried to estimate how many mergers there are in the U.S. economy, over $1 million, and maybe 10,000 a year. I mean, this involves lots and lots of businesses. The federal agencies have a requirement, a legislative requirement, that mergers over a certain value, and now it's about a little over $100 million, be reported, pre-notified to the agencies so that they can do at least a quick check as to whether it deserves further investigation. In recent years, there's been somewhere between 1,400 and 1,700 such filings, clearing this roughly $100 million threshold. And of those, the agencies undertake a serious investigation of about 50, about 3% of those that are filed, some tinier fraction of those that occur. So there may be 50 total investigations between the two agencies per year. Again, years are different. Number of mergers is pretty volatile, but that's roughly the case. Of those 50, there are enforcement actions of some sort taken against 30 or 40 of them. Relatively high fraction of those that go to that serious investigative stage end up being subject to some type of enforcement action. That can be a court challenge, it could be a remedy of the sort that I described before, or it could be abandonment of the merger under the threat of some agency action. But a total of 30 to 40 of them, 60 to 80% of them end up with some resolution involving where the merger is not consummated, at least not as proposed. So how many trials are there per year? The answer is 2, 3. I mean, hardly any go to trial. And it is because a large fraction of those that are now reported and investigated are remedied in some fashion rather than undertaking a court challenge. Now, the agencies will say, and Commissioner McSweeney may address this too, is that every time the agency goes to court, it's a very expensive proposition with uncertain consequences. The expense factor means that, as I'm told, every time the agency goes to court, this displaces some other investigations that they may do and want to do, and because there are other things going on that they wish to attend to more carefully. So there are many reasons why there are so few court challenges. Some of them can be resolved with more resources to the agency. We now have a gigantic economy with lots of important and large mergers. And we have agency budgets and staffing that really have not grown commensurately. But again, there's this large number of which a much smaller fraction are investigated, and a yet smaller fraction go to some resolution.
So continuing with that, Fiona, the DOJ has taken, a few to trial recently, I don't know, 6 or 8. They haven't lost since H&R Block Tax Act, which is kind of amazing. FTC's a little bit more mixed. I guess I have 2 questions. One is, talk about the resources involved in challenging. I guess John touched on that. But also, what are the risks? I mean, if they go to court, the thing if they lose, it can close without a divestiture, even an asset sale at all. So talk about the risks there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, litigation is risky because you're dealing with real people, witnesses, documents, data, and, you're not quite sure how it's going to play out on the day. The judge is a human being who's had experience that is kind of randomly drawn. So the judge may be sure that 2 guys in a garage can write a software program to do your taxes in a minute, or may not. So nobody likes that kind of risk, and that's why you tend to see settlements, because the firms don't like it either. There's also a risk of creating new law that is disadvantageous to future competition enforcement. So I'm thinking about, for instance, the American Express appeals decision that was released recently. I think there's a lot in there that economists don't actually like very much, and we're stuck with it for a while. The thing about risk, though, is that it does, I think, create a bit of a bias against litigating new goods. It's much less, I think, inside the agencies, it's perceived to be less risky to do something like typewriters or supermarkets or cell phones, because we've done lots of those before, and there's precedent out there, and you can rely on it, what sort of evidence there is. But if you keep litigating typewriters and you never turn your attention to handsets, then the fraction of GDP that's getting away from you is growing over time. And litigating new goods with new kinds of evidence and new kinds of empirical techniques is more risky because nobody's done it before and no judge has ruled on it before. So I do think that there's a little bit of a problem there. And while the 100% success rate, I think, is really due to both the excellent staff at DOJ and also in large part to Christine Varney, who, when she came into the job, focused the agency on litigation readiness. If you're going to block a merger, you can't just decide to block a merger. You have to have a complaint drafted, and you have to have a litigation team staffed, and you have to have an expert witness chosen, and all of that has to be done before the deadline imposed by the merger, because the way you block it is by going to court and filing a complaint. So that investment was really critical in making the division successful in court. The sort of not the silver lining, the opposite of the silver lining of 100% success rate is that really does tell you that the agency probably should be taking more risks. I mean, if you're winning every merger that you challenge, you're good at it, and that probably means the cases you're picking could be a little more aggressive. And, since there's error that goes both ways, even if you think it's the right thing to block, and you go forward, you shouldn't really win all of them because, as I said, there is all these moving parts. So that would be my reading of the situation.
Thanks. So Barry, there's 4 huge mergers right now going on in ag inputs. You've got Dow DuPont, Bayer Monsanto, ChemChina is buying Syngenta, and Potash Corp is planning to merge with Agrium. Can you talk about the ag economy and what kind of revolution this might be if these were allowed to go forward?
Actually, Diane, if you don't mind, I'd actually want to touch on this issue about the effects on workers, which you raised in your introduction. Because this, as we're talking about inequality here, that's what the subject of this meeting is. We've heard a lot of conversation about the effects on consumers, but anti-monopoly policy and law was, for most of its history, aimed primarily to protect the interests of producers and which includes the worker. And one of the things that, since the source of inequality is partly the fact that, as John said, he mentioned the fact that in these mergers that he studied, there's been a price increase of 9%. So that means more money in the hands of the few. But what we are not talking about, what we need to talk about much more, is the fact that when you see this kind of concentration, you also see an increase of the ability of the few using their corporations to pay the rest of us less. So it's not merely, this is not something that affects us only as consumers, it also affects us as workers, as entrepreneurs, as producers in every single way that we produce things. So, I mean, there is a case. This is not something that happens only to little people. There was an instance a few years back in which it became known that Steve Jobs had sort of called up some of his buddies in Silicon Valley and said, hey, let's not poach each other's workers. So they created a cartel, a hiring cartel, so that the biggest corporations in the world, Google, Apple, Intel, would not poach each other's workers. And so what was the effect? That means less liberty for those workers. It means lower wages for those workers because there's less competition for them. That's why they created the cartel. Those are the stars of the American education system, the PhD scientists, the PhD engineers, and they were made subject to a labor cartel. This happens in every single town also where you have a Walmart that sells, that runs the garage, that sometimes runs maybe the gas station. It's like across America, you had all these towns and small cities where you had dozens of little companies. Maybe it's a small town, maybe 10 different retailers serving that town. One day you wake up and all of that business has been brought under the roof of Walmart. Well, it may seem that that's actually very useful if you're a consumer, but if you work in that town and everyone who lives in that town works in that town, well, now you've gone from having 10 different buyers, potential buyers for your labor, to having one buyer for your labor. So the people in that town, suddenly they live within they accept the terms that Walmart offers them for their labor, or they have an option which is to pick up and move. Inequality is a product of people concentrating power in order to charge more. It's also a product of people concentrating power in order to pay us less and dictate terms to us. This was one of the fundamental goals of the original Sherman Act. Senator Sherman, in his speech defending that bill, said the main goal here is to fight inequality, political inequality, inequality of power. If we're going to get on top of this, we have to get back on that. And I actually just want to make one other little point here, which is kind of important, because John before said, looking at this idea that there's been a 9% increase in prices that was not necessary because we didn't actually, as he put it, we didn't draw the line in the right place. Didn't draw the line in the right place. That makes it's okay. We just got to do a little tinkering here, right? How do the American people see that failure to draw the line in the right place? They see it as the mass. How have we experienced this over the last 30 years? We've experienced it in the mass expropriation of our farms, the mass expropriation of our small businesses. We've seen it as a stripping away of the commerce in our cities and our towns. We've seen it as the stripping away of the entrepreneurial class in our communities. We experience it as the erection of regimes of control over us and our families. We experience it as the subversion of our democracy. So it's important, very important, that Congress get back into the business. The people acting through Congress get back into the business of regulating competition, and that we take this activity away from the few experts operating in their little ivory towers.
Okay. Any questions from you folks? There's a microphone there, please. All right. Gentleman in the red tie, go for it.
Hi, my name is Matt Stoller. I work for the Senate Budget Committee. So one element that I read in the 1968 merger guidelines was stopping mergers that led to more concentration in industries in general. And one of the things we see is that bigness tends to beget bigness. So PBMs, hospitals, drugstores, pharma, mergers in one area cause concentration in another. You're seeing it up and down the food supply chain as well. But our analysis is institution specific. So today, sort of reminds me of the financial crisis when regulators were all looking at their particular silos. We look at national banks, we look at bank holding companies.
I'm sorry, can you cut the question?
I will. It requires a little bit of lead up, but I promise there's a question. So our merger analysis is institution specific, and that's a problem because you have these supply chains that are concentrating up and down the supply chain. Is this a fair analysis of a gap in antitrust policy? And if it is, how do you address it?
I'll let Fiona speak to this as well, but let me give you a minute to think about that.
I appreciate that.
So the merger guidelines and the original legislation does talk about incipiency doctrine. That's what you're discussing. That is, that there should be attention to mergers that foreshadow further concentration in an industry, and the agencies are empowered to address those. And I think that some of my data show that that's what they have not been doing. Let me take airlines as Exhibit A. Not that I'm picking on any industry or agency, but 10 years ago there were 7 or 8 major carriers, and there were 4 major mergers in this period of time. We're now down to 4 remaining major carriers. Every one of them, there was a reason for them, and the agencies accepted the rationale, but we've lost all of the degrees of freedom. The next carrier to go belly up or want to merge creates an intractable policy problem. It seems to me that's what the incipiency doctrine was intended to address. That is, to prevent this sort of cascade of mergers that got us up to the brink where there's serious trouble. The other issue, not quite the same thing, but also a fair one, has to do with in vertical supply chains where a merger at one stage precipitates a merger at another stage in order to recreate or re-equalize, rebalance market bargaining power between the stages. There is more attention to that, but I think that that's an area that until quite recently perhaps was not given sufficient weight in the antitrust process. But Fiona, you were there when some of these hit, were you not?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but I'll just comment further on the bargaining issue. If you've got consolidation in one part of the supply chain and that reduces competition in that part of the supply chain, I don't think the answer is we should create less competition in another part of the supply chain in order to balance. I mean, 2 wrongs are not improving the situation. If you have a lack of competition in one place, I just think you need to go after fixing it there and not allow a lack of competition in another place in the hope that that's going to balance it out in some way.
Actually, I mean, this is a really important question, actually, and I think the answer that the questioner is, seeking is actually the system as it is now, our policies as they are now structured are actually not at all built to deal with this issue, especially in a global world. And there's actually a case that we're dealing with right now on vitamin C. And some of you may have heard about this. Now, vitamin C is something, it's not just the little pills you take, it's not just something you get in your orange juice. Vitamin C is also known as ascorbic acid. It's used as a preservative in almost all the food that you see on store shelves. Vitamin C is this really important discovery, is actually the synthetic creation of vitamin C back 100 years ago was something that allowed us to sort of improve our health significantly. By what we have seen over the last 20 years in the United States with the production of vitamin C is first we saw a European vitamin cartel come in and strip away the activity of synthesizing vitamin C from U.S. corporations. We then saw a Chinese vitamin cartel come to the United States and dump vitamin C in our marketplace until they drove the Europeans offshore. Once all of the vitamin C on which the United States depends, once the production of that had been centralized in China, then suddenly the price of the vitamin C went up 400%. Now, there was a case brought by some of the companies that buy the vitamin C against the Chinese vitamin cartel. They won that case. Recently, just I guess it was 2 weeks ago, that case was overturned because in the court, the Chinese state came, this is after a sort of pushing in a strategically working to steal the production of vitamin C from the United States, strategically using this to raise the prices of vitamin C. They said, there's nothing you can do about it because this is a policy that falls under the purview of the Chinese government. So if you look at what happened to this one link in the chain of activity and how that has been captured and how the prices have been raised, what you see in the fact that we actually have no strategy to deal with this, you see the need for a pretty radical rethinking of anti-monopoly in that respect as well.
And our time is up. Thank you so much for your attention. The second panel is coming next.